And so I'm going to begin by just sort of setting the stage. So of course, I've done a lot of natural language processing work, but in the last half year, I, like many others, recognized the need to apply whatever talents we had to combating issues that we were seeing with COVID. And I had been very alarmed in February by the fact that here in Hong Kong, already 99% of the population voluntarily started wearing masks, even in January. And yet, given all the same information, that people all over the world had, the same thing was not happening in California, in the US, where I am also based, and in Europe as well, and other parts of the world. And, I started to ask why and what could be done about it. And so that led to a project that I will show. What's going on? I'm sorry. I'm trying to share the screen, and my computer is telling me I can only do this. It says Zoom will not be able to show the contents of the screen until it is quick, because I've set the preferences now to allow screen sharing. It's the first time on this brand new MacBook Pro that I've had to share the screen. So apologies. I will let it go ahead and restart Zoom so that the screen can actually be shared. So just give me a minute to let it cycle through that. I'll be right back.
Bye.
There we go. That was
technology.
Thank you all for making it. That was the morning session with DeKai. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope there's a lot you can take out of it. And B, I think it's worth getting up at 2 a.m. for this. So
yeah, definitely. It was such a very wonderful session. I really enjoyed hearing what DeKai had to say.
I think we should give him a 5-star rating for this session.
Absolutely.
The brand new computer. I also had a brand new computer. I returned it the next day, but it's already here.
That's quick.
Quick, fast new computer. Damn, you're back.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah, technology, sorry. Let's see if the share screen will work now. Looks like it is working.
For now, it's working with you share. Yeah, here we go.
Good. So this is what has happened, just to let you know where we're going. So the output of this, which comprised a white paper, scientific paper, videos, and an online simulator, went pretty viral. It has been all over the news from what you can see on the screen. Is it legible on the screen, or is it probably too small for you?
Oh, it's okay. It works.
It's okay. I can try to increase
Vanity Fair. And then you can also move the slider. Everyone on your screen, you can move the slider to make the screen bigger and the guy smaller.
Right. Okay, so that might be a little bit more legible if you're on a small screen. So this, was on it was the cover story on Vanity Fair. It was the Vox article that led with this was, getting tweeted by Obama. Governors like in Colorado and other critical states in the U.S., as well as lots of countries in Europe, were tweeting about this. And this has continued. There are more things that aren't even on this site yet. We really got a lot of people to start shifting their mindsets over the springtime outside of East Asia about masks, to the point where now I think in most of the places where you are, it's pretty widely recognized that it is a bad idea not to have most of the population masking up. But this was not the case when we started doing this. And so I'd like to show you the situation that we found ourselves in. And I spoke about in a quick 6-minute talk, which I gave an extended version of with you, Nikki, in May. But here is just a 6-minute summary to catch up with the bias issues, the unconscious kind of bias issues that my work in AI is now dealing with. I'll go ahead and fire this up.
Next up, that's a web translation AI pioneer and Google AI Ethics Council member. DeKai, over to you.
Are sick and contagious. Masks are unnecessary. Don't wear masks unless you're medical staff. You need N95 masks to protect yourself. Sip a hot drink every 15 minutes to kill the virus. The coronavirus will remain an Asian problem. We needn't worry. The virus is an escaped Chinese bioweapon. No, it's an escaped American bioweapon. It's a Chinese virus. Chinese eat bats. Misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation are running rampant. Love in the time of coronavirus is scarce, replaced by irrationality, fear, and hatred. The pandemic has been shadowed and increasingly overshadowed by a panicdemic and an infodemic. The AI algorithms that are powering advertising-based news and social media and search continue to generate enormous profits. They're profiting by exploiting us humans' built-in unconscious biases, our cognitive biases. These are biases that evolution hardwired into us. The overconfidence effect, the pseudo-certainty effect, ambiguity effect, Dunning-Kruger effect, bias blind spot. Advertising profit is maximized when AIs prey upon our unconscious. Our civilization, our planetary group of humans, have been joined by AIs who are exponentially amplifying our unconscious groupthink bias. The AIs are encouraging disastrous government responses, especially in democracies. And the AIs are amplifying disastrous mass behavior, false senses of security, panic buying, ineffective preventative measures. The AIs are driving disastrous polarization, both unintentionally as well as via political abuse. Amplifying conspiracy theories and racism. The AIs are machine learning the same human unconscious biases that are our Achilles heel, all in the name of profit. We're building AIs to track and fight this, and you can help us to map the misinformation flows, the unconscious cognitive biases they're exploiting, because otherwise, governments make disastrous mistakes, like believing the coronavirus would remain an Asian problem, so the West need not worry too much. You know, social media amplified our representativeness heuristic to make wrong predictions from experience of similar events like SARS, MERS, or Ebola, without realizing we were overestimating its ability to predict accurately. Social media fed our present bias, focusing us on immediate payoffs instead of thinking about future trade-offs a couple of months in the future. And without doing this, AIs drive polarization and hatred with memes like Chinese eat bats causing COVID. Chinese don't eat bats. Some wild game likely transmitted the bat virus. And oh, by the way, wild game is widely eaten in most of the world. But profit-seeking AIs learn to exploit our confirmation bias combined with affinity bias, which biases us towards people like ourselves, and selective perception, where our expectations affect perception. Social media drives polarization and hatred by spreading the Chinese virus meme. AI is preying on our empathy gap. We don't call H1N1 swine flu the American virus, even though the CDC says that's where it started. The AI kicks in our defensive attribution bias to blame someone else as the outcome becomes more and more severe. AI is amplifying framing bias, which misleads us to conclusions based on how a situation or issue is narrowly or metaphorically described. It's leaning in on the reiteration effect, making us believe things via repeated exposure so that familiarity overpowers rationality. Politicians abuse information weaponization to deflect blame.
As reported in Nature Medicine, it's not an escaped bioweapon, but politicians can abuse AI to amplify hostile attribution bias, making us unconsciously interpret others' behaviors as having hostile intent. They get AI to feed our belief bias so that we'll rationalize their conspiracy theories. Thanks to our continued influence effect, we'll believe previously learned misinformation even after corrections. So that misinformation still influences our inferences. And even worse, AI makes huge profits off of the backfire effect, feeding our unconscious desire, when confronted with counter evidence, to just double down and strengthen our incorrect beliefs even more. AI propagated misinformation hurts mass behavior. Many of you have read you should sip a hot drink every 15 minutes to wash the virus down and let the stomach acids kill it. You know, sure, staying hydrated is always good, but that does not kill the virus. Colbert called this truthiness. It's the illusory truth effect that makes us believe falsehoods that are easier to process. The same effect is propagating disastrous misinformation, that masks are mainly for protecting yourself. But guess what? No, everyone should wear masks to stop their own droplets from coughing, sneezing, talking, from infecting others. Masks are mainly to protect your fellow community. So why are governments still saying masks are unnecessary to avoid using up masks instead of encouraging universal mask wearing? What they're doing is they're feeding our reactance, which makes us resist constraints on our freedom of choice. The fact that successful universal mask wearing strategies were all in Asia, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, feeds our reactive devaluation, where we devalue proposals only because they originated with a perceived adversary. It feeds our not invented here bias, because this approach was developed outside our group. We cannot afford to keep letting profit-seeking AIs drive means that cause disastrous mass behavior. Mask wearers are not sick and contagious. No, mask wearers are selfish and community conscious. All of us need to pitch in, stop AIs from amplifying our unconscious stereotyping and attribution errors. Please help us to teach our bias-fighting AI. Go to dek.ai/unbias. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was brilliant, DeKai. Thank you so much for that.
Bear in mind, this was way back in March when all of these memes were incredibly widespread. And so what we went on to do, a team of myself with 4 other people, cross-disciplinary, all based in European countries, was to do this work both theoretically and empirically to write these papers that found their ways quickly into the top scientific councils in various European countries, American states, and became an extremely widely read paper that was reported by the likes of Vanity Fair. This was also heavily generated by this little 4-minute video that again sort of went viral, and it was an attempt to say, okay, what could we do to use our skills to get around this cognitive bias problem? And so, you know, this is one of several strategies I want to talk about today. This was relying on taking, you know, quite old established notions in AI that we have of modeling complex dynamic systems of interacting intelligent agents, but making this visual so that people who were seeing things politically could just sort of grasp it concretely and try to sidestep the languaging framing problem. And it's easier for me to show you the 4-minute video than to try to talk through it, which will take longer. So let me just go ahead and do that.
In light of global lockdowns, exponential death rates, and a global recession, it's clear that measures need to be taken to curb the spread of COVID-19. Using sophisticated computational models, we've found that if the majority of people mask up by about day 50 of the outbreak, we can greatly curb the spread of the virus. If we wait much longer, though, this opportunity will disappear. As of late April, day 50 for much of Europe and the Americas is immediate, within the next few weeks. If at least 80 or 90% of the population wears masks by then, we'll not only be able to flatten the curve, we'll be able to significantly reduce the spread of the virus and return to life as normal sooner rather than later. To show how this works, we've developed an interactive computational model that anybody can use. Here's how it works. These lines represent how the disease may spread if no interventions are made. Blue is for healthy people who are susceptible to catching the virus. Orange is for people who have been exposed. Red is for people who are infected and infectious. And green is for people who've already recovered or passed away. By day 100 after the outbreak, a lot of the population has gone from susceptible to either infected, exposed, or recovered. And by the end of the timeline, most people have not only been infected and exposed, they've also recovered or passed away. These dots represent different people. In this run, there are 200 people. To begin with, 198 are healthy and 2 are infected. Now let's look at some parameters. The mask transmission rate is how effective your mask is at preventing droplets from your nose and mouth from reaching others. The mask absorption rate is how likely drops from the outside are to make it through your mask. While N95 masks are at least 95% effective, depending on the material, homemade masks are between 68 and 85% effective. Now, let's press play. As you can see, when an infected red dot hits a susceptible blue dot, it becomes orange or exposed, and then red or infected. This is reflected in the graph. The advantage of this kind of model is that it shows you how much variance there is in what can possibly happen. Each time you run it, even with the same parameters, it'll be a little different. And this is to account for random behavior. Maybe someone shakes hands with an infected person, for example, and then goes home to unknowingly infect their family, and maybe they don't. If you run the model many times, however, you'll find that it tends to average out. Now let's see what happens if the population starts wearing masks. Look at what happens to the curves. Even when the masks are only 70% effective, it's enough to significantly reduce the spread of the virus. This is super important as it buys time for the hospitals. The peak of the red curve is much lower, meaning hospitals will not be overloaded. It also helps buy time to develop treatments and vaccines. Let's try something else. This time, the population begins by not wearing masks. On day 50, though, 90% of people start wearing them. Now see what happens. Although more and more people were initially exposed, as soon as 90% of people mask up, the spread stops and starts to level out. This means that even if people only start wearing masks at day 50, it's not too late to significantly reduce the spread of the virus. Now let's see what happens if only half the population mask up at day 50. This might happen if mask wearing is only recommended and not enforced. As you can see, the virus is not nearly as well contained. Having just 50% of people wearing masks is not enough to prevent the virus from spreading at a high rate. Finally, let's see what happens if people don't start masking up until day 75. As you can see, at this point, it's too late to stop the rapid spread of the virus. This is why we recommend that by day 50, at least 80 or 90% of the population wear masks. Even if they're homemade, this model shows that it can still make a real difference. Once again, as of late April, day 50 for much of Europe and the Americas is immediate, within the next few weeks. It's therefore important that people start masking up as soon as possible. Remember, by wearing a mask, you're not just protecting yourself, you're also protecting those around you.
So this was one successful way that we found to really actually shift the mass consciousness. It both educated the public through a lot of TV coverage, even in places like Birmingham, Alabama. Who is it that's in Mississippi? You'll probably understand what I'm talking about. At the same time, it still took too long, and even today, it's taking a long time. There's awareness of masking, but there is still widely, for example, people running restaurants and having people taking their masks off to eat and drink, but in packed, confined quarters. And that's where a lot of the outbreaks, I think, are continuing. We certainly saw that in Hong Kong in the third wave outbreak that we're just beginning to suppress now. And I think in places like Spain and so forth with tourists, that is likely to be one of the causes. And so we still need to look for other approaches to solving these problems. And so in the other work that I alluded to earlier in the Unbiased project, we're looking at how do we take the decades of progress that we made in machine learning, in pioneering machine learning in order to get machines to learn how to translate between natural human languages, and see how we could apply that to the biasing problem that we're seeing today. And we are witnessing this problem right and left today. What is happening is that people are framing ideas using particular metaphors of the types that I was showing in that first video. And that is driving people unconsciously without, they're taking mental shortcuts to make decisions and to take positions without actually doing all the fact gathering and the rational analysis and the statistically significant empirical reasoning. And it is affecting not only our handling of COVID, it's affecting socio-political issues at large. If you, like me, have watched the DNC and RNC conventions, we are seeing that. I mean, just a couple of hours ago, I was still hearing about the China virus and deflecting blame, from, I mean, we've had 6 months to handle this crisis and we still haven't done it in the US. And why can politicians get away with this? Well, it's because Twitter and the other social media that are AI powered today are helping to exponentially amplify that effect. They are mindlessly in profit-seeking mode, exploiting our unconscious cognitive biases to trigger the worst of our impulses. Outrage is the best clickbait to get people to follow, and it just reinforces all the confirmation biases. And so when we look at, like I've been asked multiple times in the last month to speak about the implications of things like GPT-3, the latest iteration of deep learning. And the thing is, while these are definitely impressive parlor tricks, it is, they do surprising things and they're really fun and cool and gimmicky. But underneath that, they are still just doing essentially unconscious free association and mashups. They're like dreaming. The fact of the matter is that GPT-3 is glorified autocomplete. This matters because of the social implications. It matters because human intelligence is based on natural language. The natural language is not just another application area of AI. It's actually the foundational cornerstone of human intelligence, which is based on our linguistic abilities to formulate abstract thoughts, to think by talking to ourselves. And that is exactly what our pet dogs and cats cannot do. And it's not just language that is the cornerstone, it's specifically translation. Because if you think about it, language, monolingual language is actually meaningless and useless unless you're able to interpret the language, right? And what is it to interpret? Well, interpretation is just a synonym for translation. Machine translation is the same thing as machine interpretation. It's just like, what are your input representations and what are your output representations? And so, when we look at things like GPT-3 and the other deep learning systems that are the entire hyped bandwagon right now, and bear in mind, I'm speaking as somebody who started playing with what we now call deep learning in 1989 and 1990. My postdoc year in 1992 at University of Toronto, I spent the entire year playing in Jeff Hinton's lab. Jeff Hinton is the granddaddy of deep learning back at University of Toronto now and also at Google. And the problem, which even Jeff would agree with, is that when we measure these tremendous progresses in machine translation today, people are still showing what we call the blue score. This is a technical term. The blue score is, let me just get techie for 10 seconds here. It's an n-gram-based metric that tries to automatically measure how good the translations are. Now, the key intuition here is that blue score is based on these n-grams, which are just little short sequences of, say, 3 or 4 words in a row. And the way it's judging how good is the machine translation is by comparing how many little snippets of 3 or 4 words in a row from the machine translation match to 3 or 4 word snippets in the human translation. And this is what the objective function, this is the aim that is being used to train the machine learning systems. And the problem with this is that you have a bit of circular reasoning here, because if you tell the machine, well, please learn to translate better. And by the way, translating better means to get more little short snippets of 3 or 4 words correct. That is not really capturing what it means to actually get the translation abstractly correct. It might be good at very literal translations, but we've shown a whole bunch of 3-year-old language examples that don't get translated correctly. Why? Because English frames ideas in very, very different ways than Chinese frames ideas. You can't do word-by-word translations if you want to actually preserve the pragmatic impact, the meaning of what the Chinese person said. When you translate it into English, you lose so much in translation if you do it word by word, if you try to do a literal translation. And so what we need to do is measure real abstraction ability. For example, like in our lab in the last 10, 15 years developed something called the MENT metric, as in what was meant. It actually judges what percentage of semantic frames get correctly translated between the English and the Chinese. And it turns out that it correlates far, far, far better with human judgments of translation quality than this blue score, which keeps on getting reported. It's actually the state-of-the-art translation metric these days. And so, you know, the problem with the current deep learning systems and what we're tackling in the research labs here is that it doesn't find those deeper abstractions and generalizations. One, because it's not being asked to, because it's being given the wrong objective. And two, because the fundamental architectural limitations mean that it cannot learn it. It's just this glorified autocomplete. And it doesn't have a way of really representing even these abstractions. And so when we couple that with the fact that few-shot learning isn't, you know, so it's often characterized, GPT-3 is often characterized as few-shot learning. I don't know if you've heard this term. It's really not few-shot because you have to do massive amounts of pre-training. It's trained on 300 billion words of English, right? And then after they do that, then they say, oh, by the way, if you give me a few examples, it can learn just from those few examples. Well, no, sorry, those 300 billion words that you pre-trained it on was also part of the learning. So this is like, you know, Wizard of Oz. It's like, pay no attention to the wizard hiding behind the curtain, the wizard that you trained on 300 billion words of English already. And just to put that in perspective, 300 billion. Human children learn English or Chinese or whatever their mother tongue is, after having had only 10 to 15 million words spoken to them in their entire lifetime up until they turn about age 4 when they master their mother tongue. You know, 10 to 15 million words versus 300 billion words. Real AI isn't big data, it's small data. Current deep learning models, think of them as gas guzzlers. Right, and you've probably heard people say data is the new oil, and if you run into deep learning, you know, completely deep learning, what's the word, you know, religiously adherent to deep learning type people, they will say, just give us more data, you know, give us more oil, give us exponentially more oil. And sure, that could produce small, you know, small improvements. But here's the thing: where we should be, and where human children and human adults actually are, we should be building Teslas, not gas guzzlers, because real humans don't need that much data. Real AI is small data. And so there's a race today between those who are trying to get progress with exponential amounts of data collection, normalization, and aggregation versus real AI development, where we're moving away from the old gas guzzlers to the Teslas that are more similar to humans. And the question is, who will succeed first? Because data might be the new oil, but that could be irrelevant in an era of clean, fuel-efficient vehicles. If we had real AI, we wouldn't need large parallel corpus. And I'm saying that as the first person to have ever collected a large parallel Chinese-English parallel corpus back in 1991, when there was almost zero Chinese content online. So we're taking a look at how those decades of translation learning can be applied to the bias problem that we've been talking about. Because what is that? That, is like, when I came here, Hong Kong we still had shanty towns in this neighborhood in my background. China was barely, on computers, much less internet. My department created the first internet service provider of the entire region, because how could we establish a world-class university with no internet? Okay, this was 1991, but still, in computer science, we had internet. Today, when we look at the problems, for example, in the US, when we think about what we just witnessed if we watched the RNC convention versus the DNC convention, the problem is this, is that when I speak to my uncle in Kansas City, he doesn't understand me at all. My way of framing ideas is nothing like his way of framing ideas. The metaphors that I chose to frame the ideas do not resonate with his unconscious cognitive biases and vice versa. And to start looking at how we can overcome this catastrophic polarization that many of our societies are beginning to face, we need to look at how to do cultural translation. It's not Chinese to English translation even anymore. This is like coastal Californian to Kansas City translation that we need to do. So we're moving from like semantic framing, which we pioneered in machine translation learning, to that sort of metaphoric framing of social political issues. And we just had a project funded to work with the United Nations on this in service of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so this is the sort of stuff that I think is becoming hugely important, because that polarization is happening not only domestically, but it's happening geopolitically as well. In non-COVID times, I'm a week here and a week in Berkeley, a week here, a week in Berkeley. I see both sides of the Pacific. I read media across all sides. I see with my own eyes what's going on. And it is incredible how much bias there is in the way every single Western media outlet is reporting what's going on here in Hong Kong, which is a heck of a lot, and to some extent vice versa. I have to say the reporting here of what's going on in the West is far more detailed and nuanced than vice versa. But that has serious implications with creating the same kind of polarized dynamics where people are just talking past each other rather than actually solving problems. They're attacking people rather than attacking problems. And as we see the current administration in the US amping up the chest beating and the military showboating, and China reacting and doing the same and whatever. This is, I mean, we have seen this movie before. We saw this movie before World War II. We saw this movie before World War I. We saw the Cold War. This is really disastrous, because all of those previous world wars, we had not even invented nuclear arms yet. Much less, today's nuclear situation, which is super scary, remains super scary. And all the AI and robotics enabled warfare, and the biotech enabled warfare, and biotech, genetic technology is heavily AI driven again. We cannot, this is not sustainable. We cannot go that route again. And unfortunately, we're passing that 80-year window that societies seem to forget the lessons of the past, because the generation that suffered and swore never to do it again is passing away, and the younger generation is falling into the same trap of thinking, oh, that could never happen. No, AIs are actually today, even the weak AIs, the gas guzzling AIs that we have today, are driving us exponentially back into that same trap. And because they're appealing to our unconscious cognitive biases, we're not even conscious of it. And that is absolutely, absolutely disastrous. So, you know, people have been talking about the current AI era in, like you've probably heard the fourth industrial revolution, that sort of thing. It is more than that. And I think it's a little bit potentially risky to frame it that way, because everything actually changes. This is not an industrial revolution. This has never happened before. Everything changes if you go beyond automating labor and muscle, which was the industrial revolution, and now move to automating opinion and thought and influence. Because those are the things those are the glue that bind societies. And we've gone and we've replaced that glue now with mindless profit-seeking autonomous machines. And so that's why my research group now is adapting all of our work on learning how to translate, how to interpret, how to reframe toward the problem of working on not these mindless profit autonomous machines that are just mindlessly dreaming on, but rather on artificial mindfulness. I have tons to say, but I think it might be good to open some discussion. Is that right, Nikki?
Totally is. Totally is. So much food for thought. Open the floor.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really interested and love learning more about the project. And so my question is, like, the average person isn't aware that AI exists in places, in specific places. And let's take Facebook, for example, right? Facebook is sort of one of the newsfeed algorithm is one of the biggest sort of ways, like, it exploits people's bias. Do you think it's reasonable to sort of expect transparency in how algorithms make decisions? So, like, why when you look at a piece of content, you can click a button and understand why that's been recommended to you?
Yes and no. So a lot of our research has to do with what psychologists call the system 1 versus system 2 distinction. System 1 is this unconscious mental processing. It's in psychological terms, it's automatic processing. My PhD thesis at Berkeley was actually titled Automatic Inference because it was trying to draw attention to the fact that the establishment's AI's models of at that point in time were all based on logic-based, rule-based systems, and those are models not of system 1; those are models of system 2, which is our conscious, controlled reasoning in psychological terms, and it's things like mathematics, algebra, playing chess, other things that we struggle with because they require conscious attention, and we do it better than other animals. That's what gives humans intelligence beyond other animals. It's heavily linguistic because we are often using language to sequence our attention and work through the steps, but it is slow, and that is why we have both systems, because, like, if you were sitting there thinking, oh, sitting, that was a verb, that was a pronoun, and and that was the subject of the pronoun, right? You would be sitting until next year just processing the first paragraph of our conversation. And so the system 1 processing has the evolutionary advantage of being very, very fast, but it also has the disadvantages of hundreds of unconscious cognitive biases that tend to exaggerate our reactions. Again, for evolutionary reasons, it was helpful because, like, if you saw a quick motion behind the bushes, you would get shocked and run, and 99 times out of 100 you could be wrong, that, like, it might be just the wind blowing the leaves or something, but no harm done. You just ran for nothing. right? But that one time that you ran and it was actually a leopard, it saved your life, right? So our system one processing is super fast, but it's heuristic and it's often overreacting. And that gives rise to these unconscious cognitive biases. That's why fear is 3 times more powerful than any other emotion. And all the politicians in Washington, D.C. know that, and all the people at Facebook designing the newsfeed algorithm know that. And so part of the issue there is that this system one processing, which, you know, neural networks and probabilistic models and deep learning models are models of that. You know, that my PhD thesis was one of the earliest models to apply that to natural language processing, because that is how we do natural language processing. But we have to be aware of those weaknesses as well. Right now we're not. We're just putting everything, you know, in charge of these system one inspired models. And the problem is that you can't open up someone's brains and look at the gazillions of neurons in our brains and point to, oh, this is why you unconsciously came to that conclusion. This is why you overreacted. It's a complex dynamic system. It's not a logic-based symbolic system. And this makes it very difficult to be transparent about why a neural net-based AI like Facebook's newsfeed today made those predictions. Could you do it to a certain extent? Yes. Would it be fully accurate? No. If you tried to do nothing that was not explainably transparent, then you would cripple your AI's accuracy in much the same way that it would for a human if you removed our system one abilities and tried to reduce us to, you know, Spock, who was always an intriguing character because he was supposed to be logical, but you know, from an AI point of view, everything he was doing was constantly system one. And you know, you'd remove all the intuition from the humans. So like you would not be left with something intelligent anymore. So no, I don't think you could make newsfeed fully transparent. The best you could do is what we humans try to do with mindfulness, which is that, you know, if any of you have done mindfulness training or you know, that sort of thing, then what we are doing is we're trying to use our system two abilities to monitor what our system one unconscious is doing. It's a type of reflection and introspection. And that is dangerous also. There's a concept that I talk about, which is the illusion of explainability, because explainable AI is this big buzzword in AI ethics these days, to your question. And the problem is this, is that when you, the only real way to do it is what I just said, which is the machine analogy to when we do mindfulness training. We're trying to be aware of what our unconscious is doing. But we have a strong tendency, it's one of those biases, of actually having our conscious system two thinking just rationalize in hindsight what our system one unconscious biases made us do.
DeKai, I have a question. When we met for the first time 5 years ago, your message was that we're educating AI. So we have to be careful how we talk to Alexas and Siris and how we feed contents, because we're basically teachers of a child called artificial intelligence. Is this still true? And to what extent has AI already learned from us, from our behavior in the past 5 years?
I think it's even more important. So that point, so this comes from a talk on artificial children that I gave. It's true for both types of AI. Today's weak AI, the gas guzzlers, the deep learning models. What is the training data? The data is us. Okay, the data is these things. So this here, this is my, you know, all of us are carrying around these things, and these things are AIs. They're learning from observing us. They're learning by looking at what I spend my time reading, at, you know, what I click, and on what I say, what I reward with my likes or my shares, my reposts. And it's a whole brood of children. This is my Apple AI. This is my Facebook AI. It's my Google AI. It's my Amazon AI. It's my Twitter AI. And the thing is, that's just exactly how children are. They, you know, and my Facebook AI is different from your Facebook AI. My Facebook AI is learning from my behavior. Your Facebook AI is learning from your behavior. And so just like human children, they're learning what they get rewarded for from what we do and how we behave. And the problem is that whatever the designers of the Facebook newsfeed algorithm do, what I just said is still true. And so in the AI ethics and society community, we have this problem that you know, there are really three parts of the AI ethics and society stakeholders. There are the governments and the regulators, you know, sort of the nonprofit think tanks that are formulating policy. There are the big tech companies and small tech companies, that, you know, the commercial interests. And there are the people, the billions of users. And all the discussion right now, 99.9% of the discussion in AI ethics and society is focused on the first two. Oh, let's blame the government or the regulators, they're not doing their job, or let's blame big tech, they're being evil. Lots of good points there, but it fails to recognize that just like human children, you can't ignore the population. No matter what a government does, no matter what companies do, if human parents don't raise all of their billions of children properly, your society will not function. If everybody just goes around obeying just the letter of the law of a government, including the corporations, society would break down. What actually holds our societies together are all the unwritten rules, all the shared norms and conventions, and the values that you know, members of our society individually share and teach our children. Well, today, each of us has, you know, dozens of artificial children that we are raising. They snuck up on us and adopted us. And you know, so ask yourselves the question, how are you doing at parenting your artificial children?
I think this is a beautiful closing word. DeKai, thank you so much. I really loved the session. I really liked it, the update, but also bringing in your first thoughts and giving an update on parenting AI, combining it with the unconscious bias, how we're actually producing opinions right now. It's big thoughts. Thank you so much for this. I really, really enjoyed the session.